All right, Roger, thank you very much. And thank you all for making time this afternoon to join us. I am Sam Farmer, and I'm a neurodiversity community self-advocate, and I actually prepared slides to share with everybody for this presentation. This is my vision for a lasting and successful workplace neurodiversity type scheme. There's a lot of talk, like Roger said, about this. This is only my perspective on this as somebody who is neurodiverse. But everybody has valid opinions, valid things to say, whether autistic, non-autistic. But for what it's worth, this is my perspective as somebody who is now 53 years old, been an information technology consultant now for going on 27 years with a single employer. Been very, very fortunate to have had a lot of success in my particular workplace as somebody who is neurodiverse. So based on that kind of experience, there are things on this topic that I have to say, which also take into account all that I've learned from other neurodivergent folks who mostly I interact with on LinkedIn, the social media platform. I've learned a great deal from them, from others on this subject. Kind of all rolled into one presentation here. Very quickly, I have a book. Many of you know about this already, but for those of you who may not, the book is called A Long Walk Down a Winding Road. I think of it as kind of a hybrid memoir / self-help type book, where I've been very fortunate to be happy and successful in my life, in spite of all the challenges and adversity that I've faced. I thought I'd write a book to share ideas and insights as to how some of us may be able to achieve greater happiness and success in spite of whatever challenges and adversities we face, supplemented with real stories of lived experiences over the course of my life as somebody who was late diagnosed as autistic, but who just prior to age 3 had been diagnosed with a learning disability, which I now kind of look at as a learning difference. I talk all about that in the book. And then the self-help areas listed down here, strategies that I've learned from real life experiences for rising above bullying, workplace success, developing social skills and social competencies, marriaging, which in other words is like being a good spouse, all that I've learned there, parenting, and perhaps most importantly, self-esteem building, or as I see it, learning how to love who you are. And that's the book in a nutshell. So, why did I come up with this kind of framework for what I view as lasting and successful workplace neurodiversity? I came up with it because though I have heard about some very inspiring success stories of autistic and other neurodivergent individuals thriving in the workplace, in my view, we don't hear nearly enough about these kinds of success stories. The CEO of a company I consult for sits on the board of the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. And he was kind enough to introduce me to a number of individuals there who shared with me the story of an individual by the name of Dan Berger. Dan is an autistic computer scientist who got his start at the Frist Center at Vanderbilt. He was part of a supportive work environment that knew to focus on his strengths and on what he could contribute, that set up a work environment that enabled him to be at his best, and which as a result he thrived in. As a computer scientist, went on to make substantive contributions, for example, to NASA's Kepler Space Telescope program, etc. And after learning about Dan's story and also considering my own success story, I got to thinking, what sorts of workplace strategies could be implemented that could ideally lead to many, many more of these kinds of success stories at the workplace. And the result of all my thinking and ruminating on this subject is what I call the kale framework, pronounced like the leafy green vegetable, kale, but not exactly spelt that way as an acronym. I think I get away with it, maybe barely, but I think I do, where it's C-A-A-L-E. Could kind of, I think, be pronounced still as kale. And the acronym, in short, is C for collaboration, A for accommodation, another A for acceptance, L for listening, and E for empathy. And in my view, and in that of others who I've spoken to, who have read this particular article of mine, we agree that this could kind of be a framework that ideally wouldn't just be relegated to the workplace, but ideally could apply to society at large, to living in general. But I thought about it really within the context of the workplace. So the first pillar of the kale framework, collaboration. What do I mean by that? Between companies and organizations that help implement neurodiversity hiring initiatives, there are a number of companies out there who continue to enlist outside help with becoming more inclusive workplaces. They enlist the help of these organizations to implement these neurodiversity hiring programs, which not only focus on the hiring aspect, but also on the onboarding process of bringing new hires into the workplace and doing all that can be done to ensure their success. For example, take Google. A company as big and resourceful and as huge as Google is, nonetheless, they saw fit to go outside their organizations to implement their autism hiring program. In their case, they went nearby to Stanford University and worked with the Stanford Neurodiversity initiative. They call it actually the Stanford Neurodiversity Project. So there's that collaboration between Google and Stanford. You have the example of Dell Technologies, who went to the Arc of Philadelphia and got help from the Neurodiversity in the Workplace Initiative, NITW, and many, many, many other examples of collaborations that occur between companies looking to be more inclusive of neurodiversity, but who may not have all the knowledge or tools or resources to get there and to get to where they want to be, so they bring in outside help. The other aspect of the collaboration pillar of the CALE framework is this notion that at the workplace, where you have neurotypical or non-autistic individuals and neurodivergent individuals learning how to work together, expanding their collaborative skills and interpersonal intelligence as a result, and that aspect of collaboration at the workplace, where inevitably, when you have that kind of diversity, there are great opportunities for growth in these areas, where you have differing employees with different perspectives on perhaps a given business problem to be solved, different sets of strengths, unique attributes that many would argue, including me, can be a real boon for the workplace in terms of kind of trying to avoid being one-sided. Just the benefits of diversity and inclusivity that the products, the services, whatever the company is offering, would inevitably benefit from more than one perspective on things, from multiple perspectives, perhaps resulting in that product or service being able to solve issues that are broader in scope, perhaps, than would otherwise be the case. And so that's the collaborative aspect of the framework that I'm envisioning. Moving on to A for accommodation. In short, accommodations would exist to enable neurodivergent workers to be at their best, to be able to fulfill their true potential. But the critical point being that you want to work to avoid a situation where accommodations that perhaps may be granted to some individuals but not others at the workplace could lead to resentment, perhaps to jealousy, could be used as a basis for stigma or marginalization at the workplace, sometimes even leading to people getting fired because of this kind of toxic atmosphere that you'd want to avoid at all cost. Where my thinking here and the thinking of many who I hear from on LinkedIn in particular is this notion of why not take into account the wants and needs of all employees, whether autistic or non-autistic. Regardless of that, we could all use different kinds of accommodations. That if the workplace culture values all of its employees and takes the time to ask and to consider how all employees, autistic and otherwise, could be at their best, then in my mind, that helps to avoid the scenario spelled out in this second bullet point. If everybody feels that they matter and that they are being accommodated in realistic ways to do their best work, then you greatly minimize the possibility of resentment or of marginalization if everybody can be made to feel valued and listened to and accommodated. Whether it's that I'm at my best if I'm able to work remotely, for example, 1 or more days out of the work week. In the case of neurodivergent people with sensory sensitivities, to have a work environment or an area in the workplace where noise is kept to a minimum, where the lights are dimmed for those who may be sensitive to light or to too much noise. Maybe some employees do their best work when they're working alone, as opposed to having to be working in a team where they may not feel comfortable. For visual learners, if you're in a meeting and people are talking about things and there are challenges in digesting the information that you're hearing with your ears, to provide visual aids, or perhaps to provide transcripts or meeting minutes after or ideally before the meeting, to enable visual learners to be at their best. Those kinds of accommodations, whatever they might be, certainly for neurodivergent individuals, but perhaps also to be extended to neurotypical or non-autistic individuals, so that everybody feels valued. And what I just described fall into these categories of sensory accommodation, work style related accommodations, how different people work best, you know, the auditory learners, the visual learners, that I work best alone or that I work best in a team dynamic, etc. Just to give a few examples among many that companies are beginning to offer to enable their employees to be at their best. That's the accommodation pillar in a nutshell. The other A for acceptance. Ideally, the workplace culture would be accepting of neurodiversity in these various respects. To accept neurodiversity for what it is, which simply is the fact that in the human population, not everybody's brains are wired the same. It's not as if those in the neuromajority are in the right, and those that are in the neurominority or who are neurodivergent have to be pointed out as being wrong, or that it has to be pathologized or stigmatized because it's outside the mainstream, but instead to understand that intrinsic naturally to the human population is the fact that you have a variety of different neurologies, that we all have our brains wired in fundamentally different ways. And this is a natural aspect of the human population, not that some are in the right and others need to be marginalized or pathologized, where unfortunately society, as we've talked about earlier in earlier talks, tends to pathologize difference, tends to pathologize what's in the minority. Coming to an understanding and an acceptance of what neurodiversity is, and that it's a reality for all humans. Accepting that societal expectations were not written with neurodivergent individuals in mind. We're often expected to live up to these expectations, even though they were not written with us in mind. And that as a result of that, Going back to the accommodation pillar, in many ways, the accommodations that we ask for stem from that. Help us to better live up to expectations by granting certain accommodations that enable us to be at our best. Accept that neurodivergent people have lots to offer to the workplace. Dan Berger, for example, me, for example, and I'm sure you guys as well who participate in the workplace. But only if the workplace environment and culture is one that cultivates an environment in which we are able to succeed. Too much emphasis on deficit, on what we have a hard time doing, on what some of us simply can't do, and more of an emphasis on what we can do, what we can offer, all that we can contribute. It's all in how you look at things. Ideally, there would be an acceptance that all of us, whether neurotypical or neurodivergent, have lots to offer. We deserve to be in a workplace environment that would allow for that. Accepting all employees for who we are, allowing us to be our true, authentic selves without adverse consequence. Without acceptance, how can you really have that? In the absence of acceptance and in the presence of stigma, of pathologization, of marginalization, it can become very scary and often prohibitive, sadly, for many of us to be able to be our true, authentic selves without adverse consequence. Dan Berger was very fortunate. I've been very fortunate that I've been able to reveal my diagnosis, share my book, share my articles as I have with my coworkers, and be thanked by some of them for sharing what I have to say. I'm very, very fortunate that I am able to do those things without adverse consequence. To me, I'm thankfully part of that kind of accepting environment that I feel all of us deserve. But if you are out looking for a job, if you're in a job environment that you're not comfortable with, that you would like to move away from, whoever you consider working for, you would want to try to ask the right questions or try to learn from other people. Look, what kind of workplace environment and culture would I be looking at? And really with all of these pillars is to know what to look for in a workplace, to know what kinds of questions to ask when you're being interviewed. When you do your research into a company, what to look for. Because these are all things that we would all want to be able to have in whatever workplace we're a part of. Obviously, acceptance is critical. In its absence, things become very, very difficult, obviously, for those of us who are neurodivergent. L for listening. All of us have stories to tell. All of us have lived experiences and beliefs on things that ideally, in a truly inclusive workplace environment, people would be encouraged to share their story, again, without consequence. But the telling of those stories so that we're sharing ourselves with the hope that we would be understood and accepted for who we are is all for naught if those stories are not listened to, which is why L for listening is part of my framework. What we share with others is for naught unless we are listened to. The more we share our lived experiences, ideally that helps to bring about greater acceptance of neurodiversity and can help to weaken the stigma that we are undeservedly up against. The more we tell, the more people hopefully would understand. And this is how these various pillars tie together. Acceptance, listening, accommodation, collaboration, they're all interconnected. They're all dependent upon each other in these various ways. What we say matters, but only if we are listened to. And that the words that we share about who we are, about as autistics or neurodivergent individuals, what we deal with, what's it like to be who we are, that what we say would not just be listened to, but ideally taken to heart. My fear is that even though I feel those are reasonable requests of others, my biggest fear is that being listened to and having our words taken to heart may be too much to ask. And that's, I think, the challenge at hand. When we ask to be listened to, and moving on to empathy, when we asked to be empathized with, we can only hope that we're not asking for too much. Therein, I think, lies the biggest challenge. And ultimately, empathy, the E in the CALE framework for empathy. When somebody is able to put themselves in another person's shoes, if they're able to understand things from another person's perspective, if they're able to feel what other people feel, imagine all the problems in the world today, not just at the workplace, but in the world, in society in general. If everybody could exercise greater empathy, think of how many problems that would solve in terms of how it can strengthen cohesion, bridge differences, provide for greater interconnectedness between us or within a workplace perspective between the workers there, the employees. To enable all of the other pillars of the CALE framework that we just talked about to take hold. It all becomes a whole lot easier if we are better able to exercise empathy. You could have the greatest neurodiversity hiring program in existence, but it will not reach its full potential in the absence of at least some measure of empathy. And maybe the L for listening. Listening perhaps can be a necessary prerequisite to being able to empathize. When you listen and you learn and you take those words to heart to start out with, to me, that can be a pathway, ultimately, hopefully, to having a greater ability to empathize. It's something that I feel we can all do. It doesn't require anything extraordinary in terms of any kind of exceptional ability for somebody to be able to put themselves in another person's shoes, feel what they feel. But it does take a commitment, and it does take the will to want to do what's right and to be more empathetic towards your fellow employees. And to me, this is key for any inclusive workplace that actually is inclusive, to actually live up to what it claims to be, to have some measure and capacity for empathy in the workplace. And knowledge is power here. If I am collaborating, if I'm a workplace collaborating with whomever to implement a neurodiversity hiring program, if it's me working with that organization that helps companies to implement neurodiversity hiring programs, I am stressing the importance of making people aware of all these benefits of intra-workplace empathy. If people understand what the benefits are of a given type of workplace culture, if they're educated on what those benefits are, the more likely they would actually exercise it. And that holds true for all of these. Hopefully that's what organizations helping to implement these neurodiversity hiring programs are doing, that they're teaching everybody involved of the benefits of these kinds of workplace behaviors and of the kind of culture that leads to greater inclusivity, greater success, and greater diversity and equity, more inclusivity. And that's the CALE framework in a nutshell. Collaboration, accommodation, acceptance, listening, and empathy. All of which I feel are important in their own ways. For more information, there's this one article that I wrote with the same title as this workshop. The link is mentioned here. I've referred often before to the Asperger Autism Network, AANE. They're particularly strong with respect to all their support group offerings, many of which are virtual, a good number of which are free of charge to participate in. For more information on these support groups, the website is aane.org, their events calendar, and if you subscribe to their newsletters list out all the various support groups that they offer. And there are a ton of them, one or more of which are bound to be the right fit. And then the link to the article that's relevant to our discussion today. For any of you who would want a PDF copy of this slideshow, you can go to samfarmerauthor.com and go to the contact page, reach out, leave a message asking for a PDF of this presentation. I'll be more than happy to share it with you. And also at samfarmerauthor.com, you'll find links to other articles that I've written that are relevant to workplace neurodiversity. I've written articles about the Dell Neurodiversity in the Workplace Initiative. I wrote another article about the Google-Stanford collaboration. I've written other articles that touch on the subject. It's not just this article. There are several others that are there on the media page that touch on this topic. And you can also enter your name and email address, as some of you already have, if you'd like to be added to my mailing list, where whenever I publish a new article, whenever there's a new author talk to announce, in person, virtual, the people on my mailing list are the first to find out about those new publications, newly scheduled events. It's all at samfarmerauthor.com. And that's all he wrote, so to speak.